Up in the northwest of the USA, right on the Canadian border, are two states that contain the largest contiguous wilderness areas outside Alaska: Idaho and Montana. These wilderness areas are tempered with multiple small airstrips for easy access, and in May 2017, a group of 7 in 4 private airplanes flew the roughly 950 nautical miles from Alamogordo, New Mexico, northbound to explore these remote airstrips in Montana and Idaho once again.
Alamogordo White Sands Regional Airport. Automated weather observation 1334 Zulu weather. Wind calm. Altimeter 2985 inches of mercury. Remarks: density altitude 6,000 feet.
The 4 airplanes flew on separate routes, and the group would meet at the West Fork Lodge in Montana.
Alamogordo traffic 162 Charlie is taking runway 22 for departure. Alamogordo.
After passing Albuquerque, Canyonlands and Salt Lake City, we landed in Camarillo, Wyoming for refueling.
Also hier gibt's lecker Sprit, ne, für die Dokumente. Weiter geht's.
Remarks: density altitude 8,300.
3.5 hours later, we landed at the Salmon Airport in Montana. The weather further north toward the West Fork Lodge was not in our favor. Roughly 2 hours later, we checked the weather and decided to give it a try. After hopping over the ridgeline of the Beaverhead Mountains, we followed the Bitterroot River downstream, where we reached our destination in the evening hours. The Husky with Rob and Yannick had not arrived the evening before, and we had not heard anything from them. A few calls later, we figured out that Rob had hurt himself during refueling in Blackfoot and was not able to fly anymore. While the others would stay at the lodge, Wolfgang and Georg went on a rescue mission down to Blackfoot. After they had arrived in Blackfoot, it took a while until they had tracked down the both of them to the Best Western Motel. And while Rob was flying back with Wolfgang in the Cessna, Yannick and Georg would take the Husky back to the lodge. For today we had planned to get used to the mountains and the rugged terrain. Therefore we wanted to fly to Shara, Moose Creek and Wilson Bar, some of the easier airstrips. In Hanselman's book Fly Idaho, Shara is called the epitome of the wilderness flying experience. The strip is lying secluded and private deep within the 1.2 million acre Selway Bitterroot Wilderness. Shara sits adjacent to the Selway River, and of the 3 big whitewater rivers in Idaho, Snake, Salmon and Selway, Selway is the extreme for limited access and wilderness. Departing can be tricky. Climbing terrain prevents a straight-out departure for some aircraft. But after liftoff, you can fly out along the river by making a left turn into the river channel. We continued our flight to Moose Creek, which lies deep in a narrow canyon at the confluence of the Selway River and Moose Creek. Much of the approach is in the blind, and one should always announce position and intention over the radio. steep turn brought us into the base leg and into the final, and we continued our approach close to the canyon walls and the trees at the right side of the canyon, following its curvatures. Although Moose Creek is not one of the more challenging airstrips in Idaho, it is for sure one of the most beautiful ones. The here located ranger station is listed with the National Register of Historic Places. Regarding to the book Bound for the Backcountry from Richard H. Holm, a few years ago there was a dispute involving Hollywood actor Harrison Ford, a United States Forest Service employee, and a few camping tables. Ford and his friends have tracked the Idaho backcountry for many years. Ford owns a few aircraft, including a 2-ton de Havilland Beaver, which he used to pilot into those airstrips. Apparently, Ford and his entourage, flying a pack of Huskies, set up camp on the lower end of the short runway, gathered all picnic tables not in use, and pushed them together at their spot.
I hope I didn't wake you up. No.
The Forest Service employee happened by was not too pleased with what they had done. After a little wilderness lecture, the tables were returned to the appropriate locations. Believing everyone was on the same page, the employee returned to the ranger station, only to be interrupted again when the group ran out of water. Instead of making a nice walk to the station to get some potable water, Ford cranked up his Beaver, taxied up the runway to the station, filled his containers and taxied back. Ford's actions did not sit well with the US Forest Service employee, and she returned to the camping area and gave him a piece of her mind. In the end, Ford apologized for not respecting the unwritten wilderness rules. Wilson Bar was next on our agenda. From Moose Creek it was just a 50-mile hop southwest bound to the solely public airstrip at this 120-mile long part of the Salmon River.
Nice.
A few minutes after Florian and I had parked the airplane and shut down the engine, Wolfgang and Robert arrived with Rob and Yannick on board. Soon they left again, and Florian and I took the opportunity to explore the area a bit and to take some drone footage. This gorgeous grass strip lies deep on the bottom of a 3,000-foot canyon. It is tucked around a bend of the Salmon River, also known as River of No Return. The strip is a one-way landing. One lands downstream and departs upstream. You are not able to see the landing zone until the last yards. It is surrounded by ponderosa pines, and native wildflowers are growing on a green meadow. The sound of the Salmon River is omnipresent, though not overwhelming. After about 1 hour, we also took off and departed upstream for salmon, where we wanted to get some fuel before flying back to West Fork.
Yeah, you have the controls. Oh, what a nice day.
Where are these guys from? North Mexico.
May 28th was the day we wanted to move our base camp from the West Fork Lodge to the Eagleport Lodge at Sealer Lake Airport, where we had made reservations for 3 separate rooms. While Wolfgang wanted to make a short flight to Shera with Rob and Yannick, Robert and Debbie before flying to Sealer Lake, Florian and I had planned to take it slow and fly directly to our new destination further north. For today we had planned a big tour the evening before. At first we wanted to fly to St. Ignatius to get fuel. Next stop was Meadow Creek, then Schaefer, and finally Glacier National Park, with a quick stop at Rhinefield. Florian and I, in the Cessna 180, were number 1 to go. The others would follow. The morning was beautiful with blue skies and no wind. The day before, I had noticed a little reservoir on our way up from the West Fork Lodge, and I thought we could do a bit low-level flying along that reservoir before reaching St. Ignatius. Only later on the video we could see that in some flight positions we were losing fuel through the tank vent valve on the left wing, which is normal and no problem. St. Ignatius is a community of roughly 850 and rich in history and native culture, located on the Flathead Indian Reservation in the heart of the Mission Valley. It was established by Belgian Jesuit Catholic missionaries. We arrived first at the gas pump and topped our tanks off. In the meantime, the others had landed and one after another were pushed to the pump to get fuel. Soon everyone was ready to go and we did start the engines. After backtaxing runway 08, I took off first, only to be followed by Robert and Wolfgang. Debbie would meet us again at Meadow Creek. Along the Mission Mountain Range, we flew northbound. Wolfgang had planned to follow my Cessna 180 very close to fly in the vortices. He wanted to check out how strong these were and if one could establish a stable flight in that position. We had planned that I would exactly keep altitude and speed when he tried to approach. After some price, he broke away and did set himself up as number 3 after Robert. At about the south end of the Flathead Lake, the group turned right and crossed the Mission Mountain Range, the Swan River and the Swan Range, passed the 9,300 foot high Swan Peak on the left, and had soon reached Meadow Creek. Meadow Creek is on a plateau above the confluence of Harrison Creek and the South Fork of the Flathead River, just about 2 miles outside of the Bob Marshall Wilderness. It is a great camping spot and surrounded by tall trees. We made a walk to the edge of the plateau and had a glance at both rivers flowing below us. It is said that the Flathead River is usually gin clear and icy cold. Well, at this time of the year, it wasn't. Our next stop was Schaefer Meadows, in my opinion the most beautiful airstrip in the Great Bear Wilderness. We would visit this strip another time this week, so this time we landed only for a short lunch break and we talked about flying in the Glacier National Park, the next destination today.
And 1626 Charlie taking off 25.
few minutes after takeoff, we reached Glacier National Park and were able to marvel at those icy and rugged rock walls from the air. Still full of impressions from this great flight over the national park, we flew to Ryanfield to have another break. There we could take the courtesy car and drive to the small town of West Glacier, which is also the main entry into the park, and get something to eat. Later that day, on our way back, we followed the Flathead River downstream, past the Flathead Lake on the east side, and flew along the Mission mountain range to Ronan for refueling. After a side trip into the valley around the snow-covered McDonald Peak, we landed safe and sound at Sealy Lake Airport. For today we had thought about a round trip to Schaefer Meadows, Ryanfield, West Glacier and back. From Sealy Lake we climbed over the Swan mountain range and dove into the valley of the Flathead River. In a low-level flight we followed the river downstream. A few miles later we turned east toward the Great Bear Wilderness and reached Schaefer Meadows after about 1 hour and 20 minutes, where Wolfgang, Rob, Yannick and Debbie were already waiting for us.
He might have something to say.
As said before, the Schaefer Meadows airstrip is, in my opinion, the most beautiful public airstrip within the Great Bear Wilderness boundaries. With the Flathead mountain range in the west, the Rocky Mountains in the east, and Glacier National Park in the north, it is surrounded by heavily timbered mountains. At this time of the year, most of the airfield was covered in yellow dandelions. Here you are in grizzly bear country, and you should always take the required precautions.
Schauen, wie du dich konzentrieren kannst auf den Final.
Wieso?
Ach, du hast gar nicht gesehen?
Doch, ich hatte euch gesehen, aber ich hatte...
Ich hab dich gemoont auf dem Final, du hast es nicht gesehen. Ich hänge über den Balken drüber und hab meinen weißen Arsch in der Sonne. Du hast es nicht gesehen?
Ich hab, glaube ich... Wir haben da was Braunes, ich hab gerade was Braunes gesehen. Rob habe ich gesehen, mit seinem hellen T-Shirt.
Ach so. Scheiße.
Siehst du dein...
Ich bin direkt über den Balken, habe ich gesagt, das kriegt er nicht hin. Der lacht sich so tot, dass er nicht mehr landen kann. Aber dann habe ich deine Landung gesehen, die sah ganz gut aus. Ich habe das nicht gesehen.
Thank you. I'm used to that.
He didn't see it.
I told you I didn't think so.
At the east end of the airfield lies a camping area between the trees. It is quiet around here, with only the sound of the wilderness, the birds, and the purl of a little creek. No phone, no fuel, no services. This is wilderness airplane camping at its finest. Definitely no place for social media junkies.
Anaconda Mining Company won that bid and built that.
So. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8.
Okay, these are men in their 40s.
It is so quiet and peaceful around here that the sound of the starting C-180 almost hurts. A few hours later we all took off from that beautiful airstrip I had probably seen last for a long time and headed toward Rhinefield, from where we wanted to drive to West Glacier for lunch. Ryan Field is a private airstrip which was donated to the Recreational Aviation Foundation by Ben and Butch Ryan, who used to live here. Ben passed away in 2017, 94 years old. He, however, did build a few airplanes which in 2017 could still be seen in his old shop. In the 70s, he did build this 2,500 foot long airstrip by filling in a low drainage between two mostly level benches. The couple began, quote, the process of donating their property to the RAF in 2003. They asked that it be taken care of after they were gone and to make it available to as many pilots as possible to enjoy. In the meantime, the RAF has turned the land back to its original form, much the way it was the day Ben and Butch first set foot on the property. House, sheds and hangar were removed, and the RAF did decide a barn would complete the picture. They contacted Amish barn builders to build an Amish post and beam barn that would make the Ryans and everyone else proud. End of quote. After we had been in West Glacier for lunch and a little stroll, we thought it would be time to fly back to Sealer Lake and to call it a day. We refueled the courtesy car and drove back to the airstrip. This time we had planned to fly southbound along the Hungry Horse Reservoir. The huge reservoir was an open invitation for low-level flying. We took off one after the other, Robert and Yannick first, then Wolfgang and Rob, to be followed by Debbie. Florian and I with the cameras took off last. Short before reaching the lake, we picked up the husky in front of us and directed Robert via radio into a position where Florian was able to record him with his cell phone and where the camera mounted under my wing was able to catch him flying low. one point we changed behind him from his left side to his right side and flew right through his vortices. The emerging turbulences were well noticeable but harmless at this range. That was definitely one of the best flights so far. There was no noticeable wind, no turbulences, a beautiful landscape and a yellow husky as lead we were following. The only thing missing was some nice music over the headset. This here was it, fast, low and exciting. I could have flown this way for hours. Eventually, we split it up and continued our flight following the shoreline on the west side of the lake. Every lake ends somewhere, and when we came to its end where the Flathead River flows into the lake, we pulled up and went back on course to Seeley Lake. Next morning, the sun was shining and Robert had a whole airfield for his exercises. Today, our time at the airport lodge had come to an end, and we had room reservations for a hotel in McCall, Idaho. From McCall, Wolfgang and I wanted to introduce our European friends to a few central Idaho backcountry airstrips and show them this awe-inspiring part of wilderness. We took off at Seeley Lake, flew southwestbound over Missoula, crossed the Bitterroot Range into Idaho and followed Highway 12 for a while. When hitting Highway 95 and the Little Salmon River, we turned south. It was a bit hazy today, more Germany-like, but after 2 hours and 30 minutes we landed in McCall. The weather was undefinable today. Clouds were hanging low and it was expected to get some showers during the day. Hence we had not planned any huge trips but wanted to fly to the Sulphur Creek Range for breakfast and see where we can get from there. It was also Rob and Yannick's last day before flying back to Alamogordo and to the Netherlands. From Cascade, where we had stopped earlier for refueling, we flew west and entered the Frank Church River of No Return Wilderness a few miles later. The Sulphur Creek Ranch is a private guest ranch with a history going back to the 1920s and the destination for a nice rustic breakfast. It is usually open during the season from June 1st through end of August, and we would probably be the first guest this year. In the wilderness areas, human activities are restricted to scientific studies and non-mechanized recreation. Horses are permitted, but motorized vehicles and equipment are not, with the exception of aircraft for easier access to these areas. There is no road connecting the ranch to the outside world, hence everything which goes to the ranch has to be brought in by packing horses or aircraft. Even the mail is being brought in by aircraft once or twice a week. Once there, you can either stay overnight or rent a cozy cabin for a few days. So that's with $200 per night, not a cheap treat. Or you can go on a guided hunting, fishing or horseback riding trip for days. One juicy detail of the ranch: during World War II, men were brought in by Douglas DC-3 airplanes from Mountain Home Air Force Base, since the ranch was used as a retreat where men could enjoy booze, gambling and girls. The big wooden bar, a few slot machines and some very small rooms upstairs are the remains of that time. Robert landed last with the husky, and after he had parked the aircraft, we all went to the house to order our breakfast. The main house of the ranch is a log house, but unlike the usual construction of a log house, here the logs have been joined together vertically. With $25, the breakfast is not cheap, but you get a typical big American portion of bacon, eggs, hash browns, biscuits with gravy, if one likes that, orange juice and coffee as much as you want or need.
January 1937, a traveler Air 6000 from Johnson Flying Service that was on wheels had a little incident where it went through the eye.
Debbie had gathered a few facts and stories around the ranch, which she told us when we were still sitting around the table, nipping on our coffees. Since the weather was getting worse, it was time to get out of this basin before the clouds hit the mountaintops, and to fly into the open to Smiley Creek. Florian and I took off first. We flew some kind of a holding pattern and on the way picked up Debbie in the Piper to lead her to Smiley Creek. The surrounding mountaintops were obscured, so we had to fly through the valleys. The wind had picked up and we caught some raindrops on the way. Along the mighty Sawtooth mountain range we flew southbound and soon made it out to Smiley Creek. After Debbie had landed, we flew a low approach and then Florian wanted to try landing. He was not so familiar with the C-180's characteristics and the very strong side wind made it really difficult. When the aircraft bounced, I took controls, added a bit power and landed the 180 a few yards further down the runway. We taxied to the tie-down area and a few minutes later the others arrived in the Husky and the C-180. The caretaker had just opened the airport facilities for the season, so the campground was partially flooded. We walked to the lodge, had some food and had just came back when I decided to make a quick weather check flight to see if there was a way to go west over the Sawtooth Range. After comparing the weather data on Wolfgang's Garmin with what I had seen, there was probably an opportunity to get over the mountains westbound back to McCall in about an hour. Half an hour later we could see some blue spots in between the clouds and we began preparing for our departure. Debbie in her Piper should follow Florian and me, and Robert with Yannick in the Husky would accompany Wolfgang and Rob in the 180. Later, on the way, Debbie was supposed to fly at our wing to give her a safe way through the mountains and around the clouds. It turned out that it was impossible for her to keep this position. Whenever we looked for her, she was somewhere else. 7 o'clock low, 11 o'clock low, 5 o'clock high, and as she crossed our flight path from upper right to lower left, we agreed that she should stay somewhere behind us and call us if we got too fast for her. The flight over the snow-covered mountains and around the clouds was breathtakingly beautiful. When we came to Atlanta, Idaho, not the big airport in Georgia, we decided to make a quick stop at this one-way gravel airstrip. I had not calculated the tailwind, and so we arrived too high and with too high ground speed. With 30 degrees flap set, I sideslipped the 180 but touched down relatively late. Since the runway is slightly uphill, we still came to a stop in time and far enough from the runway end. Everything was okay, but there was a wake-up call. You can't let your attention slip here at these wilderness airstrips. From Atlanta, we followed the middle fork of the Boise River downstream, passed the Weatherby airstrip, and continued our flight to Garden Valley, where we made another short stop. Debbie had decided to continue her flight back to McCall. Over Deadwood Reservoir, we met Wolfgang and Rob in the 180 again, and we both landed 25 minutes later in McCall. It was Rob and Yannick's last night here in Idaho, and we bid them farewell with a delicious meal and a cozy evening at the Pancake House. For June 2nd, the 5 of us had planned for a Salmon River South and Middle Fork tour. That meant landings at the more challenging airstrips. We were up early as recommended when flying into the backcountry, and the weather was okay, though the clouds were hanging at about 500 foot over the field. The first planned stop was Crossell, a ranger station which was built in 1937 and is listed in the National Register of Historic Places. Arriving at Crossell, we took a guess that the grass would still be wet and that the brakes had to be applied with some care, a thought which would prove right. After touchdown, the Thunder tires did find no grip on the grass and we used almost the whole length of the runway to come to a stop. Well aware that we were late already and to not delay our tour further, we took off again and turned sharp east following the east fork of the south fork of the Salmon River toward Yellow Pine. Short before reaching that tiny village, which is famous for its yearly music and harmonica festival, we turned southbound and followed Johnson Creek upstream to the airport. Johnson Creek is Idaho's premier backcountry airstrip, which means it is also the busiest during certain times of the year. Reason enough for not visiting during one of the numerous fly-ins. During some fly-ins, there can be more than 100 aircraft at Johnson Creek. This results in an enormous volume of aircraft in the traffic pattern, and it is immensely important to adhere to the prescribed SOPs and to report your position and intention by radio. Unfortunately, more and more inexperienced pilots are also being drawn from the plains to the mountains of Idaho, leading to an increased volume of accidents. This time we were solely two aircraft and we did not want to stay or camp, so after exploring the closer vicinity a bit, the hot tub was not on our agenda today, we decided to go ahead and continue our tour. Big Creek Airstrip was next, and after a good look at the 9,058 foot high snowy Goat Mountain, we turned hard right and followed the valley to the airstrip. When seeking food and lodging, Big Creek was a popular destination for pilots until the lodge burned down in 2008. Its history goes back to 1929, when some miners from two close-by mines did the necessary clearings. One of the airstrip's characteristics is that you are not able to see it from all parts of the traffic pattern, since it is hidden behind a ridgeline. Additionally, the airfield has an elevation of 5,743 foot, so pilots should be well familiar with high density altitudes and turbulent air. After checking out the construction site, where mighty logs are being used to build the new lodge, and admiring the huge fireplace built from natural rocks, we got ready to leave and to fly Big Creek downstream to the Cabin Creek airstrip. For newbies it is intimidating to fly in those rugged canyons, but the surrounding terrain is so hostile that in case of emergency your probably best chance for survival is to land in the river if you are not able to reach one of the numerous airstrips. After taking off we turned east to reach Cabin Creek roughly 17 miles later. It is, as most of the backcountry airstrips, a no-go-around one and lies in a narrow and short side valley of the Big Creek drainage. The runway 02 is a slight uphill slope and has a mountain at its end. From a certain point on, you are committed to land. At final approach, you are virtually sliding down the mountainside on the left side of the valley, jump over some brushes and short trees before the wheels touch the ground. Because of the upslope of the runway, the use of the brakes is almost not necessary. The whole area was once inhabited by the indigenous Shoshone people. It was the location of a critical encounter between the United States military and the Shoshone during the Sheep Eater Campaign of 1879. The name Cabin Creek comes most likely from a small log structure built by two squatters in 1880. In the meantime, it was almost 11:30, and the winds were picking up as well as the turbulences. Since we still wanted to fly to Soldier Bar at Apalooon, it was time to take off. Over Big Creek we turned left and followed the drainage downstream. After 3 minutes we arrived at Soldier Bar, where Wolfgang had spotted some elks. Whereas he was setting himself up for the landing, Florian and I flew a low approach to scare the elks away. We could see Wolfgang approaching the strip and did turn around to get into position for our approach. Soldier Bar is located on a small plateau 500 foot over the river and marked as a very difficult airstrip. It is surrounded by steep, rugged canyon walls in all directions, and runway 7 has a sharp dogleg. Definitely not for beginners. Hanselman describes it in his book Fly Idaho this way. Unless you want a final resting place next to Private Agon, don't take your first trip in without an experienced pilot on your side. Wolfgang and I had been there before twice, and we wanted to show that strip to Robert and Florian. Due to a tailwind, we came in slightly fast. We touched down right on the spot, bounced slightly, and due to the upslope of the runway came to a fast hold. I added some power and the aircraft was rolling uphill to the parking spot. Then we shut off the engine. Glancing at my co-pilot, I was thinking that Florian was a bit white around his nose, and his question, "Is it getting any worse? I have a wife and 3 sons at home," said it all. The airstrip can really scare you.
Wir haben überall Rückenwind, das ist der Scheiß. Du kommst mit Mordsbras rein.
Ja, ich habe da unten, ich habe es wieder gebounced, das Ding.
Ich auch.
Ich habe sie gebounced, dann habe ich sie fliegen lassen
Ja.
und dann habe ich sie runtergedrückt und habe sie einfach gehalten.
Ja, da habe ich auch gemacht.
Mit Rückenwind ist scheiße, raus geht's gut, aber das ist die Kacke momentan. Wir sind zu spät dran.
Ich weiß. Ja.
Wenn das in der Früh smooth ist, kannst du da schön reinsegeln.
The name Soldier Bar comes from the gravesite of a casualty from the Sheep-Eater War in 1879, which is located near the east end of the airstrip. Private Egan was wounded in an ambush and both legs were shot through. He died a few minutes after the doctor had amputated one leg. Since we still wanted to fly to Upper Loon and then to Smiley Creek for lunch, we decided to continue our flight. From Smiley, it should go back to McCall to call it a day. The runway 25 has a big bump after 450 foot and full power can only be applied after passing that bump. This shortens the runway to 1150 foot, but with 260 horsepower and only 2 people on board, that's not a problem. Both airplanes took off and followed Big Creek downstream on the right side of the canyon. After a few miles, we turned right into the Loon Creek Canyon and followed it upstream, passing the Banner, Flying Bee and Lower Loon airstrips. 13 miles later, we could see the Upper Loon landing strip before us. We passed the runway once to check for animals, surface, wind, and made a 180 into downwind at the end. Just so, flying over the rock jutting out on the left side of the canyon, we turned hard left into the base leg and began a steep descent at the same time. Maneuvering in those narrow canyons always requires some foresight to not end up at a rock wall. The wind was blowing down the valley, which would mean a nice headwind for the landing. Coming tightly around that rock formation, we were on final for runway 22 and made a smooth landing a few minutes later. In the vicinity of the airstrip, you can find remains of a ghost town, which was responsible for the start of the Sheep-Eater War. You remember Private Egan at Soldier Bar? The Sheep-Eater War of 1879 was the last Indian war fought in the Pacific Northwest of the US. European-American settlers accused the Shoshone of stealing horses, killing 3 settlers, 2 prospectors, 5 Chinese miners and 2 ranchers, and, as so often, there was never any evidence for those accusations. After half an hour on site, we climbed back into the airplanes and took off, this time with tailwind, to fly straight to Smiley Creek for lunch. Due to the tailwind, it took longer to get the planes off the ground, but with partial flaps set and 260 horsepower, it was not a real problem. Around 4 o'clock, after we had some nice food, we left the Smiley Creek Lodge for the last time this year and headed toward McCall. We flew straight over the Sawtooth Wilderness, past a few of those mighty over 10,000 foot high snow-covered peaks, and landed about 50 minutes later, safe and sound at McCall Airport. Next day, after I had dropped Robert at the Boise airport, I topped off my fuel tanks in Jerome and flew southbound. Another great trip was over. Lots of footage had been taken, waiting for being cutted and edited into a nice video. That it would take actually more than 3 years to come up with that video was never planned, but as John Lennon once described it in a song, life is what happens to you while you are busy making other plans.